Imagine you are standing in a silent library in the heart of Paris. The air smells like old paper and ink. You see a young professor named Thomas Piketty surrounded by stacks of tax records dating back to the 1700s. He isn't looking for a lost treasure map. He is looking for something much more powerful. He is looking for the why behind the widening gap between the rich and everyone else. One shocking fact came out of his years of research. In many developed countries, the top 1% now owns nearly half of all the wealth. You probably didn't expect a 700-page book on math to become a global sensation, but in 2013, that is exactly what happened. His book, Capital in the 21st Century, flew off the shelves faster than a summer thriller. Why would a data-heavy economic history book cause such a massive panic among the world's elite? Piketty's work wasn't just a collection of opinions. It was a mountain of data. He and his team spent years digitizing centuries of financial history. They traced how money moved through families and across borders. This project became one of the most comprehensive studies of inequality ever conducted. The core discovery was a simple but devastating formula. He expressed it as R greater than G. The R stands for the rate of return on capital. This includes things like stocks, real estate, and corporate ownership. The G stands for the growth rate of the overall economy. Here's the problem. Historically, the return on investments is usually around 4 or 5%. Meanwhile, the economy usually grows at a much slower pace. This means wealth that is already sitting in bank accounts or property grows faster than the wages of people who are actually working. If you own the mountain, you get more snow. If you're just trying to build a snowman from scratch, you can never catch up. This isn't just a minor glitch in the system. Piketty argues it is the fundamental setting of capitalism. This realization created immediate drama. For decades, the dominant theory was that capitalism eventually levels the playing field. People believe that as a country gets richer, everyone gets a piece of the pie. Piketty's data shattered that illusion. He showed that without major intervention, we are heading back to the patrimonial capitalism of the 1800s. Think of Jane Austen novels. In those stories, nobody worked for a living. They just talked about their yearly income from their estates. Piketty warned that we are returning to a world where who your father was matters more than what you can do. The publication of the book led to an explosion of media coverage. It topped the New York Times bestseller list for weeks. This was unheard of for an academic text. Suddenly, a French professor was being invited to the White House and the International Monetary Fund. He wasn't just giving a lecture. He was issuing a warning. He argued that if we don't fix this math, democracy itself might be at risk. Naturally, the pushback was instant. Finance people still go back and forth on whether his focus on the past really tells us about the future. Some critics argued that his data was skewed by the unique circumstances of 2 world wars. Others said he didn't account for the way new technologies like the internet create wealth out of thin air. They claimed the new rich are different from the old aristocrats. But Piketty's data suggested that once that wealth is created, the same old rules of accumulation take over. The tension grew as the world watched the wealth gap continue to widen. Every year, the Forbes billionaire list seemed to prove his point. The numbers at the top were getting bigger and bigger. Meanwhile, middle-class wages in many countries stayed flat. People began to realize that if the math was the problem, the solution would have to be just as mathematical. And that is where things started to get really radical. Let's look at how this math actually plays out in the real world. For most of the 20th century, things seemed different. After the Great Depression and 2 world wars, inequality actually dropped. High taxes and the destruction of old fortunes leveled the playing field for a while. This gave people the idea that capitalism naturally rewards hard work over luck. But Piketty's data shows this period was a total historical fluke. He calls it the Great Leveling. It wasn't the natural state of the economy. It was a temporary break caused by global chaos. Once the dust settled, the old rules came back with a vengeance. Money started to clump together again. When someone has $1 billion, They don't just spend it on yachts. They invest it. That money makes more money while they sleep. If the market returns 5%, $1 billion generates $50 million a year. Most people cannot spend $50 million in a single year. So, that extra cash gets reinvested. The pile grows bigger every single day. This is the logic of accumulation. It acts like a gravitational force in the financial universe. You might think this is fine if the person earned it. But Piketty points to the power of inheritance. Over time, these massive fortunes get passed down to children and grandchildren. This creates a class of rentiers who live off the interest of the past. They don't have to innovate or build anything new. They just have to exist and own the assets. In countries like France and the UK, inherited wealth is making a massive comeback. It is now making up a huge percentage of total national wealth again. This brings us back to that old aristocratic world. There is a real tension here between what we are told and what we see. We are taught that meritocracy is the goal. We want a world where the smartest and hardest working people win. But if wealth grows faster than work, that dream starts to fade. It becomes a race where some people start at the finish line. This isn't just a social problem. It is a structural one. The math creates a cycle that is very hard to break. Analysts still argue about whether this trend is truly permanent or just a phase. Some believe that new technology will disrupt these old fortunes. They point to tech founders who became billionaires overnight. They argue that innovation can still outpace old money. But Piketty remains skeptical. He notes that even tech billionaires eventually become rentiers once their companies mature. They move from building things to simply owning things. You see the numbers, and it starts to feel like a trap. If the system is designed to reward ownership more than effort, where does that lead? It leads to a society where the top few hold almost all the cards. This creates a massive power imbalance. Wealth does not just buy houses. It buys influence and political power. This makes it even harder to change the rules. The loop closes, and the wealth just keeps stacking higher and higher. This cycle leads us to a controversial question. How do we stop the mountain from getting taller? Piketty decided to go big with his solutions. He didn't just suggest a small tweak to the tax code. He proposed a global, progressive tax on wealth itself. This is where things get really intense. He suggested tax rates as high as 90% for the absolute wealthiest people on Earth. We are talking about the multi-billionaires. This isn't just about taxing their yearly salary. It is about taxing the total value of everything they own. If someone has a net worth of $10 billion, a tax like this would eventually shrink that fortune down over time. The idea is to prevent wealth from becoming permanent and dynastic. Piketty wants to turn ownership into something temporary. He calls it social ownership. Imagine a stack of cash as tall as the Empire State Building. Under his plan, a huge chunk of that stack would be redistributed every year. This would fund things like a capital endowment for every citizen. He suggests giving every young adult a lump sum of money when they turn 25. This would be roughly $120,000 in today's money. This plan created a firestorm of controversy. For many, this sounds like a total dismantling of the modern economy. Critics call it a direct attack on success. They argue that if you take away 90% of someone's fortune, they will stop building companies. The drama here is real. Billionaires often claim they will just move their money to a private island or a friendlier country. This is why Piketty says the tax has to be global. He wants a world where there is no place left to hide the cash. The logistical challenge is massive. How do you even track every stock, painting, and secret bank account in the world? Governments would need to share data like never before. There's still a real disagreement on whether a global system like this is even possible in our fractured world. Some believe it would require a level of international cooperation that we have never seen. Others think it would just lead to a massive black market for assets. You might find the 90% number shocking. It sounds like something from a radical manifesto. But Piketty points out that the United States had top income tax rates near that level in the 1940s and 50s. During that time, the middle class actually boomed. He argues that we have done this before, just in a different way. The goal isn't to make everyone poor. It is to stop a tiny group from owning the entire world. However, the fear of capital flight is a huge hurdle. If one country tries this alone, the rich will just pack their bags. You can notice why this makes politicians nervous. They don't want to lose their biggest taxpayers. But the tension keeps rising. As the gap grows, the idea of a billionaire tax is moving from the fringes to the mainstream. People are starting to wonder if the extreme wealth at the top is worth the cost to everyone else. The debate has moved from the quiet library to the loudest halls of power. The backlash against Piketty's ideas was swift and incredibly loud. You can almost feel the temperature rise in the room when this topic comes up at events like the World Economic Forum. Many critics argue that a 90% tax would effectively kill the engine of global capitalism. They claim that the very people being targeted are the ones who create jobs and drive growth. If the state takes almost everything, why would anyone take the risk of starting a new company? This is the classic incentive argument that has dominated economics for decades. The tension reached a boiling point during the discussions around a global tax floor. In 2021, more than 130 countries actually signed a deal for a 15% global minimum corporate tax. This was a massive, verifiable milestone in international law. It was designed to stop companies from hiding profits in tiny islands with zero taxes. While it wasn't the aggressive wealth tax Piketty wanted, it showed that the world was listening to his data. However, the implementation has been messy and slow. Many nations are still dragging their feet because they fear losing their competitive edge. There's also the very real fear of a fire sale in the stock market. If a billionaire owns 20% of a massive tech company, they usually don't have billions in cash sitting in a room. Their wealth is tied up in shares. To pay a huge yearly wealth tax, they would have to sell millions of shares every single year. Analysts at the time argued that this constant selling could create a permanent drag on stock prices. It could hurt the retirement accounts of regular people who own those same stocks in their 401s. This creates a scary scenario where trying to tax the rich accidentally drains the savings of the middle class. Finance people still go back and forth on whether these taxes actually work in the long run. Some point to countries like France, which had a wealth tax for years but eventually scrapped it. They found that thousands of millionaires simply left the country. They took their businesses and their spending money with them. The French government eventually decided that the lost revenue from these departures was bigger than the tax they were collecting. This is the brain drain and capital flight that makes politicians lose sleep. Another point of drama is the sheer complexity of valuation. How do you tax a private company that doesn't have a public stock price? How do you value a rare painting or a secret patent? Critics say this would create a massive new bureaucracy. It would be an army of government workers fighting an army of billionaire lawyers. This sounds like a recipe for endless court battles rather than a quick boost for the economy. Despite these warnings, the momentum hasn't stopped. We are seeing more and more protests and political movements demanding that the rich pay up. People notice the trillionaire forecasts and feel that the system is broken beyond repair. The debate isn't just about math anymore. It has become a battle over the soul of the economy. The stakes are getting higher as we move toward an uncertain future. The world is currently at a crossroads that feels like a scene from a sci-fi movie. On one side, we see the potential birth of the world's first trillionaire. Reports from groups like Oxfam suggest this could happen within the next decade. On the other side, a global movement is working to make sure that never happens. In 2024 and 2025, the conversation shifted from academic books to high-level summits. Brazil used its leadership in the G20 to push for a coordinated tax on the world's 3,000 billionaires. This wasn't just a suggestion. It was a formal proposal to ensure the ultra-wealthy pay at least 2% of their wealth every year. This creates a high-stakes race between accumulation and regulation. If the trillionaire arrives first, the power gap might become impossible to close. A single person would have more financial weight than entire developed nations. But if a global tax takes hold, the very concept of a billionaire might start to fade. We might look back at this era as a strange period of history where individual wealth reached levels the human mind can barely comprehend. The drama lies in the fact that neither side is backing down. Governments are hungry for revenue to fix crumbling infrastructure and aging populations. Meanwhile, capital is more mobile than it has ever been. Imagine a world where the Piketty tax actually becomes reality. In this scenario, the massive fortunes of the elite are slowly chipped away. That money flows into education, green energy, and the capital endowments for young people. It would be a massive experiment in social engineering. Some fear it would lead to a lack of innovation. They worry that without the prize of billions, the next great inventor might just stay in bed. Others believe it would unlock the potential of millions of people who are currently held back by a lack of startup cash. Besides, economists still debate whether a world without billionaires would actually be more stable. Some argue that extreme wealth concentration is a primary cause of political polarization and social unrest. They believe that when the gap gets too wide, people lose faith in the system. This loss of faith can lead to radical movements and economic chaos. By taxing the top, they argue, we are actually saving capitalism from its own worst tendencies. It is an insurance policy for a peaceful society. However, the risk of stagnation is a real concern for many. If you remove the ultimate financial goal, does the whole engine slow down? There is no clear answer because we have never tried this on a global scale. The outcome depends on whether people are driven by the dream of becoming a billionaire or just the desire to build something useful. You notice that the stakes aren't just about bank accounts. They are about how we value human effort and what kind of future we want to build for the next generation. As we move deeper into the late 2020s, the pressure is only going to increase. We see more countries experimenting with wealth transparency registers. They are tracking who owns what with more precision than ever. The shadows where money used to hide are starting to disappear. Whether this leads to a 90% tax or just a more honest conversation about inequality remains to be seen. But one thing is certain. The math that Piketty uncovered is no longer a secret. The world is watching the numbers, and the numbers are starting to demand a change. The story of wealth and the taxes that follow it is still being written by all of us every day. It is a complex dance between the desire to win big and the need for a fair society. I would love to hear your thoughts on where this is all heading. Where are you watching this from in the world? How is the local economy feeling in your neighborhood lately? If you have big plans for your own financial future or thoughts on these radical tax ideas, please share them in the comments below. I read through them to see how these global shifts are hitting home for everyone. If you found this deep dive into Piketty's world helpful, it would mean a lot if you liked the video. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep making these stories for you. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next look into the hidden forces shaping our world. We have a lot more to cover, from the secrets of central banks to the future of digital currency. Thank you for spending some of your time with me today. Take care of your finances, stay curious, and I will see you in the next one.